greeting her son's return with mixed emotions. He is out of the U.S. military prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and back in Canada, but he is still behind bars, more than a decade after he killed an American soldier during a firefight in Afghanistan. And Moazzam Begg calls that an injustice. The British national has been advocating for Omar Khadr since his own release after 3 years in Guantanamo in January of 2005. Mr. Begg first met a 15-year-old Khadr when they were both imprisoned at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. It's unlikely that he will be making Mr. Khadr's case in Canada anytime soon, though. Mr. Begg is still on a U.S. no-fly list, and he has twice been denied entry into Canada. But he was able to contact the Khadr family by phone earlier today. We reached Moazzam Begg in Birmingham, England.
Mr. Begg, you have been in contact with members of Omar Khadr's family. How are they responding to his return to Canada?
I can say that pretty much, of course, like any family member would be, they're extremely happy that he's returned. But there's a sense of sadness that they've lost all those years that can never be returned to Omar. And the fact that he's not free, he's in prison still. And they believe, and we believe, all of his supporters, that he shouldn't have to go to prison. None of us former Guantanamo prisoners went straight to prison. We're from Western countries. We went straight back home to our families.
When and how did you first see Omar Khadr?
The first time I saw Omar Khadr was in Bagram in approximately May of 2002 in the Bagram detention center in Afghanistan, where he'd come in terribly wounded. His eye had been shot out. He had 2 huge exit wounds from his shoulder and from his chest. He was emaciated. He was weak. He was pale. And he was a boy. He just turned 15 at the time.
Was it fairly apparent that he was that young?
Very apparent, yes, very, very apparent to anybody, not just the former prisoners, but the interrogators. I know one of them has just recently written, and I've spoken to this former interrogator several times now, about Omar's case, and he said that one of the worst things he ever felt about his job there as a U.S. soldier was having to administer or to take care of people like Omar Khadr, who was a child, which was quite very evident.
How did the other inmates, the other people in the Bagram detention center in Afghanistan regard Omar Khadr?
I think everybody regarded him with a sense of a huge sense of pity that he should not be here. We could say, even myself, we could say, I understand why the Americans want to speak to somebody like me. I'm an older man. I've got more experience. I've lived life. But this is a child. And it doesn't matter which family he's come from or what the allegations against his family are. He is a child. And not only is he a child, the wounds that he suffered from are horrific. I mean, when you see the pictures of his body when he was brought in, you would never have imagined that he could have survived through that. And yet the laws of the children at war and so forth simply weren't applied on him.
You have written and spoken extensively about the abuse at the Bagram detention center, the kinds of torture people suffered. In fact, you believe you saw, 2 men died, and you believe that they died at the hands of, in part because of how they were interrogated. Do you have any idea how Omar Khadr was treated?
Yes, I used to see it quite often. I used to see him sometimes because of the allegations against him that he was involved in the killing of a soldier. He was already marked by many of the soldiers, many of the guardsmen, who would bring him out from his cell, hooded and shackled legs and hands, drag him across the floor, make him pile up crates of water bottles with his shackled hands, with his wounds, and then they would kick those crates down again, all only to tell him to pile them up again. And constantly that would happen. Sometimes his hands would be tied to the top of the cage with a hood placed over his head, and he'd be left there for hours.
Did you actually see Omar Khadr get this kind of abuse from the American soldiers?
Yes, with my very own eyes. We were in the same cell together, same communal cell together for a couple of months. So, and I remember sitting talking to him because you couldn't tell whether he was crying or not because his eyes were so badly damaged. But he wouldn't complain. He would sit there in a corner and just be very, very quiet and silent.
Did you speak with him?
I did speak with him, yes, even though we weren't allowed to speak. And one of the things that he used to say to me, literally he used to say to me these words, "Nobody cares for me, nobody cares about me." And he was right.
You were moved on to Guantanamo Bay, so was Omar Khadr. Did you see him in that detention facility in Cuba?
No, I didn't, because I spent most of my time in solitary confinement. But Omar Khadr is one of these people that everybody knows about him. And I sent an email just recently to former Guantanamo prisoners all over the world. I mean, literally from Bermuda to Sudan to Tunisia and Bahrain, telling them that Omar has been freed. And I got so many replies back saying finally they were so happy that he's been released. So everybody knows about the case of Omar Khadr. If there's one person everybody knows about in Guantanamo, it's Omar.
And what did they think of him? What was the sense or feeling from other inmates toward Omar Khadr?
Well, I think if you look at what's happened to him, there's all these statements, of course, about his father. But his father was killed while he was in custody, so he had to. I remember when that news disseminated around the blocks in Guantanamo, and I remember it was very sad for him because he learned about the death of his father while he's caged as a child. In addition to that his younger brother was paralyzed, and in addition to that, the suggestion that his other brother had turned into a spy, and all of these sorts of things were happening simultaneously. So I think for him, everybody knew that it's a very, very sad story, an exceptionally sad story, sadder than for most of us who've been separated from our children and our wives and so forth. But none of us had to go through the huge ordeal that he had to, knowing all those things, and then to remain in Guantanamo as a prisoner for the next 9 years after that, it's almost unimaginable.
How would you compare the process by which Omar Khadr was eventually repatriated to Canada to how you were repatriated to the United Kingdom?
It's a big difference. There was a massive campaign that was mounted here in the UK, and there still is. There's a large number of former Guantanamo prisoners here. My father mounted a campaign. He was supported by many ministers and many members of the British Parliament, Amnesty International and others. And he managed to simply put out this statement: if my son's committed a crime, then charge him in the court of law and let him serve his time, let him come back here to the United Kingdom. However, in Omar's case, there was hardly anybody fighting for him because I think of the circumstances and the fact that there wasn't this big campaign, and there should have been. And I think that this will always be on the conscience of right-thinking Canadians, is that we allowed this child to rot in prison for almost a decade until we brought him home.
At the tribunal which convicted Omar Khadr, he did in the end plead guilty to war crimes. In your dealings with him, did he ever express regret or remorse for the role he played in that firefight that led to the death of that American soldier?
I think there are many aspects to this point. First of all, I think it's important to remember that although it's very sad for the family of I think it's Spear that he was killed. He wasn't working in a nursery. He was a soldier, a special forces operative who'd come to kill those people who were around Omar Khadr. Now, whatever the truth of the matter is, whether Omar threw the grenade or whether he didn't, the fact of the matter is that Omar Khadr has been convicted in a court that no other country would allow on its soil, not even the United States of America. You can't have a Guantanamo-style court military commission system on U.S. soil, and that's the reason why no Guantanamo prisoners were ever taken there, despite their habeas corpus claims. So the rules of evidence here are a travesty of justice, and I think to convict a boy through that, and to say that he's not only a murderer but a war criminal. And when we talk about war criminals, we think of Rudolf Hess and we think of Adolf Eichmann and people like Slobodan Milosevic. And then we have the name Omar Khadr. It beggars belief that we would try to do such a thing, to stretch the imagination to this level, to say that this 15-year-old boy is a war criminal because he killed a special forces operative who was armed to the teeth.
He did become involved with this struggle, the armed struggle, through his family. He was at a very tender age brought into that campaign and indoctrinated with it. Do you think that his family has to take some responsibility for his fate?
Well, his family has taken responsibility for his fate. They've taken the biggest responsibility. The father is in a grave. The brother is paralyzed. The rest of the family are broken. So what more would society like them to pay with? That would be the question. What more do they want from this boy? He's lost his eye. He's lost movement in parts of his feet, in his shoulder, and so forth. How much more does society want to take from Omar Khadr? And this is the travesty. This is the thing that the history books will never forget.
All right, we will leave it there. I appreciate you speaking with us, Mr. Begg.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Moazzam Begg is a British national and a former Guantanamo prisoner. We reached him in Birmingham, England.